I'm sure she said it was random sampling, and I'm pretty convinced you just chuck it. Whoa! I said we're doing transects, not random sampling. This is the core practical for quadrats and transects. So this is a quadrat, and what we use quadrats for is to measure the distribution of organisms. Now those organisms, if you're using a quadrat, either have to be really slow moving or they have to be not moving at all. So what we tend to use them for is measuring the distribution of those organisms on something like a school field. So what we can do there is look at the numbers of daisies or the numbers of plantain or the numbers of dandelions. And from that we can investigate factors that can affect how those organisms grow. So for example, one of the ways that we can do this investigation is look at the effect of light intensity on the range and distribution of those species. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at how we can use that quadrat and also how we're going to use a transect. Now at this point I'm going to explain to you what a transect is. Now a transect is just basically a line. So here's our quadrat. Now if we drew a line and we knew how long that line was, so for example, say this line carried on going for 20 metres, what we could do is we could mark out every metre on that transect and take a measurement. Now, along that line then, we would have to look at a factor that we're changing. Now in most cases, and what we tend to do with this investigation is we change the factor of light intensity. So in this investigation today, what we are going to do is look at the effect of shade on the number and the distribution of those plants on the school field. Okay, so we've come outside because what we're going to do now is we're going to set up our transect. Now, as I said inside, the transect has to show a variation in environment. So what we're looking at here is I'm currently standing under a tree where it's a lot more shady than where we're going to go where there's no shade. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to place the tape measure on the ground. I'm going to mark out my distance using my tape measure all the way along until I reach 20 metres. Now I'm going to peg that down and then I'm just going to continue moving along until I reach my 20 metres. You'll see me again in a second. So I've got to my 20 metres and I'm going to peg that there, and I'm now going to go back to the start and I'm going to measure the light intensity. So what we're going to do is measure the light intensity at each point along the transect every time I take a quadrat measurement, just to see how light intensity affects the distribution of the plants. Here we go. Okay, so I've now measured out my transect. What we said is that we're going to measure out 20 metres. So I've placed my tape measure underneath the tree where there is most shade, and I've stretched the tape measure out to where there is least shade and therefore most light intensity. What I'm now going to do then is I'm going to measure that light intensity. Now what I have here is a data logger which is going to give me a percentage of light present. Now it's really important at this point that I get down to where the plant life is, because what I'm measuring is the light intensity that is affecting the plants, and the plants are on the ground. So I'm going to take that measurement, I'm going to press the button, and I'm going to record my reading in the table. Now what I'm then going to do is I'm going to place my quadrat down at 0 metres, and what I'm now going to do is measure the plant life that exists in this area. Now what you can see is, as I've said before, there are 100 squares. So the first plant that I'm going to look for and measure the number of squares that it appears in is grass. So what we will see is there's grass here, 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 and I'll continue one row at a time, adding the number of squares that have grass in it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Now it doesn't matter if you've only got half squares filled, you keep going until you reach your 100th square, and then you record how many squares out of that 100 had grass in. Once I've completed the grass, I'll move on to my next plant, which in this case is going to be plantain. So I've got 1 plantain there, and that looks like it's that. So we're going to record just one square of plantain and the rest grass. I'll move on to my next plant and I'll keep going until I don't have any more plant species to count. Now at this point, I'm going to move on to my next measurement. Now I've decided to do intervals of 2 meters. So I measure up to the 2 meter mark. I again place my light meter on the ground. I record my measurement of light and I place my quadrat on the floor. And I go through the exact same process again. So once again, I'm going to measure the number of squares that contain the plant species, and I'm going to start with grass again, and I'll count the number of squares that have got grass in it. Now what I can see this time is I've got increased numbers of plantain, but I've also got an increase in species this time, so I've now got dandelion present. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count the number of squares that have got dandelion, either flowers or leaves present in them. Now I can ignore things like this, which have just fallen off the tree below. I move them out the way because ultimately they are not living on the ground, they're just fallen from the tree above. So I've done my measurements at 2 meters, I'm now going to move on to 4 meters, and then I'm going to move on to 6 meters all the way until we get to our 20 meter mark. So I'm at my final measurement, which is 20 meters. So I'm going to place it down at the 20 mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my light data logger on the ground, I'm going to measure the light intensity, and I'm now going to record the light intensity. Now at this point we're at 100% because we have no shade whatsoever. And what we're now going to do is count the number of plant species. Now this is probably where it's going to become more problematic for you because there's so much more plant life here. Now that is ultimately what we were hoping for, and the reason is that the more plant life there is, the more likely that's due to the fact that there's greater amounts of light. The greater the light intensity, the more photosynthesis that can happen, and so therefore the more food that can be made, which can be used for respiration, which obviously enables growth. So this is where it's going to get a little bit difficult for you because there's so many more plants to count. But what you need to make sure again is that you count all the squares that contain the plant species you're counting. So for example, here we have plantain, and we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because we've got 6 squares there that each have plantain in, even if they're coming from the base of the plant, which is somewhere else. Now we'll continue counting those plantain species, counting the number of grass squares until we've collected all of our data.